In this video, we are going to talk through the present levels of performance and consideration of special factors, which are two parts of the IEP development process. The present levels of academic and functional performance for the student is the way that we generate those annual goals and the supports and services that the student needs. The present level of performance leads to the development of annual goals and short-term objectives, and it should create a clear picture of the student. Also, the annual goals that you develop for a student should connect directly back to this level of performance. So this is the very first step in determining what the student needs in order to be successful in the general curriculum. When we talk about present levels of performance, they need to be very specific, so we can't be vague, because again, this is what is going to drive that annual goal. So, for example, instead of the student is active and doesn't pay attention, we need to be very specific and say the student attends for 1 to 2 minutes during a large group activity during a 10-minute observation period. And this would allow us to determine that the student may need an annual goal for attending for a longer period of time. When you're developing that present level of academic and functional performance statement, you want to identify the student's expected performance level. So for preschool students, we use the Kentucky Early Childhood Standards. Then you want to identify the student's current educational performance. So you're going to use that baseline data, that response to intervention data, any kind of report any kind of evaluation report data. And then you're going to look at each developmental domain that's indicated on the IEP form and determine whether the child's ability is within that age range of typical expectations as related to those preschool standards. If it's typical and there's no concern in that area, then you'll just check not an area of concern, and you don't have to complete any further information. If you determine that the student's functioning in that area is not commensurate with same age peers or is not meeting those standards, then you will need to describe the student's strengths, needs, concerns. You always want to have strengths. So what is the student's strengths in this area? What are your needs related to the student's performance? How are they currently performing, and how would you expect them to perform at this age? And then you want to describe, you always must have a statement of adverse effect. So you have to describe how that academic or functional performance is impacting the student's participation in general education activities. This is a requirement in order for a student to have an individualized education program, because you have to show that the delay or disability is impacting that performance as related to same age peers. So that's the present level of academic and functional performance statement. Again, you want to make sure that you have student strengths, needs, how the student is currently performing using that evaluation data or RTI data, and then how the student is performing, how you would expect them to perform at this age. And then you always have to have that statement of adverse effect. So the second part of the IEP process that I want to talk about in this video is consideration of special factors. The consideration of special factors are a number of areas that you must address before you or as you are developing or reviewing or revising an IEP document. The present level of academic and functional performance will support whether or not a special factor exists. That present level of performance is very important in developing the IEP document. There are guiding questions in the IEP guidance document that can help you think through whether or not each area is a concern related to that present level of performance. ARC chairpersons or school psychologists can also help with this because they're familiar with all of these areas. So these are the areas that you must consider: behavior, limited English proficiency, blind or visually impaired student, communication delays, deaf or hard of hearing, and assistive technology. And again, the guiding questions can be found in the IEP guidance document starting on page 16. So the first area is behavior. So you want to consider, does the student's behavior impede his or her learning or that of others? If you check yes or no. If you check yes, then you need to describe what strategies you need to address the behavior. So you might say you've been using scripted stories, social skills intervention. You might have a behavioral intervention plan. You might be using visual supports as reminders. So any of those things, anything that you're using to support that student's appropriate behavior, you would describe in this area. You don't have to have a functional behavioral assessment or a behavioral intervention plan in place in order to check yes. You just would need to describe what you're doing to address that behavior. The second area is limited English proficiency. So does the child have limited English proficiency, yes or no? If it's a yes, then what are the student's language needs related to the disability? Language is an area that you have to be very careful about. Limited English is an area you need to be very careful about because you have to ensure that it's a disability and not a language difference. So if the student does indeed need special education services and they are limited English proficient, you need to describe the child's English, what you have in place already as the child's English learning plan. What is the child's level of English language proficiency, and what kind of skills does the child have in English? And then that will need to be documented by the ARC. The third area is the child blind or visually impaired? Again, you would check yes or no. If you check yes, you would need to consider the need for Braille instruction, unless Braille is not appropriate for the child, and you would also need to address orientation and mobility services. There would be a consultant for the blind or visually impaired involved with a child who is blind or visually impaired, so that person would be a support. The next area is communication needs. Does the child have communication needs? Again, check yes or no. If you check yes, then for this area, you must check C, present levels for communication status, because you would have described in the present level of academic and functional performance the child's communication delays or difficulties. Very often, preschool age children have concerns in the area of behavior and communication. So these are two areas that are very frequently checked yes for preschool students. And then deaf or hard of hearing. Is the child deaf or hard of hearing? Again, check yes or no. If yes, you would need to consider the child's language and communication needs. So how do they communicate? And then what opportunities for direct communication with peers and adults does the child have using that communication mode? For a child who is deaf or hard of hearing, again, you would have a consultant for the deaf or hard of hearing involved, and that person would be a support. And then finally, assistive technology. Are assistive technology devices and services necessary to implement the child's IEP? Check yes or no. If yes, you need to determine what devices are needed. So these could be communication boards, it could be low tech or high tech, it could be mobility or seating. So any area that the child has needs for support. And then that would need to be documented in the IEP. So assistive and it looks at two areas. So there are two areas under assistive technology that would need to be considered. So devices, that's any item. So again, a communication board, a mobility device, seating. But it's also services. So any service that the child needs, such as an evaluation to determine what assistive technology might be needed. Fitting, if the child needs a mobility device, they might need to be fitted for that. Training for the student or professionals if it's like a high-tech communication system. So assistive technology, as documented in the IEP, can be devices or services. So those are the two areas that I wanted to discuss in this video. Present level of academic and functional performance and consideration of special factors.